It's August 9th, 1173, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Sometimes a thing's imperfections are what make it perfect. Think, for example, of the Venus de Milo. Would it be as loved if it still had its arms, or would the Canterbury Tales be such a classic if Chaucer had managed to finish them?
Oh, yes. Similarly, sorry to destroy your opening argument. Yeah, Canterbury Tales.
Yeah. Arion can only think of one example.
He might have messed them up if he went on to debase them with a sequel.
They got weirdly right-wing further on.
That's right. Well, similarly, would we care about the Leaning Tower of Pisa if it didn't lean, as its builders obviously intended that it would not when they began its construction on this day back in 1173.
I do agree with you on that. It is the lean of the tower, isn't it, that makes it iconic. And otherwise, it's totally just a white marble bell tower, a campanile, for the cathedral complex in Pisa. But there's dozens of them all across Italy. The one in Florence is twice as tall. They must be so angry, the Florentines, because all the Pisans did is make a crap tower. But it's the thing everyone wants to see.
Yeah, and it's weird, isn't it? Because I don't know, maybe I'm just ignorant, maybe everyone knew this but me, but I didn't realise how close the cathedral and everything else was to it, because you only see the photo from the angle of just the tower itself and maybe someone pretending to hold it up with their finger. When you actually see it from the other angle, right next to the cathedral, it blew my mind. I was just picturing this standalone tower in the middle of a square for some reason.
Yeah, and the other buildings are really beautiful. But the reason that they came about is because the construction of the tower, and in fact the whole complex, was basically Pisa wanting to show off, because in the 11th century they'd succeeded in sacking the Sicilian city of Palermo, and they had so many goodies and treasures in their possession that they wanted a place to display them all. And thanks to the huge resources that they'd got from this sacking, the governor of Pisa ordered the construction of the cathedral, and this is the tower that was meant to be the bell tower. That's the offshoot that became the much more famous of the three buildings that were constructed.
I don't think it's a coincidence that the architect's name was lost to history. Because
yes,
yeah, you'd actively erase it yourself if you could.
Because weirdly, the building of the tower was paused 10 years after this date in 1173 for a century because there was a war, during which time the foundations settled, and actually possibly that might be the reason that the building was able to stand at all, even though it was leaning. But the point is, it was leaning. It was evidently leaning within 10 years of them starting to build it. I feel like at some point between 10 years after this day and the 110 years later when they started to rebuild it again under the guise of having to correct the lean, the architect was like, can we possibly just forget that this was me? Would that be okay?
Yeah, well, for hundreds of years, the tower was attributed to the sculptors Guglielmo of Innsbruck and Bernardo Pisano, and that was basically only because there was a book in the 15th century that credited them. But that was 300 years after this day, and there's more recent research which has suggested that another Pisan architect, known only as Diotisalvi, is the more probable candidate. We know he also designed the baptistry in front of the cathedral, but the most convincing evidence, but actually the most damning evidence, is that two of his other known works in Pisa, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Bell Tower of St. Nicholas, also lean. So he kind of had a signature.
So the reason that it leans is that it actually only had 3-metre foundations, and it was set in this weak and very unstable subsoil, and so it was really damned from the beginning, except for the fact that its long break, as you say, Olly, gave the soil time to compact down, allowing them, as they continued their construction, which went on for 199 years before it was completed, to try to incorporate the fact that it had this lean, which actually continued to get worse and worse until the efforts to correct it began in the 1900s.
But it's not forgivable, that oversight. I mean, we had a kitchen extension and the foundations were about 10 foot deep, right?
I agree, yeah.
How is it possible that you're going to build a 56-metre high tower in a place which is named, after all, after the Greek word for marshy land, because it's on alluvial soil, and you're not going to think, let's just, worst case scenario, let's just plan for the worst case scenario. Let's do 5-metre foundation.
Well, one of the questions is, did they know at the time that it was leaning when they first started building it? And we have evidence that they certainly knew by the time they picked up their tools again in 1272, because when they resumed building, they started building the walls on one side higher to try and compensate, which gives it the unique shape it has, because we call it the Leaning Tower, but if you actually look up closely, it's sort of got a banana type curve to it, and that's from this attempt.
Banana Tower of Pisa.
Banana Tower
doesn't
of
have the
Pisa.
same
well,
ring
they
to
didn't
it.
know about bananas then, so they probably didn't have a word for it.
Right,
they
true.
didn't have boomerangs. They actually hadn't discovered curved things at all in this era.
Uncivilized.
So
Yeah.
the only thing they could say was leaning. So they were aware and they were trying to balance it out,
Yes.
but obviously weren't willing to just knock it down and start from scratch in a less leany location.
Well, that architect's name, Rebecca, has been preserved to history, Giovanni di Simone, because there's logic there, isn't there? Like, he was wrong that you could stretch it out by making it heavier on one side, but you can at least see what he was trying to do. He was trying to correct the course.
It is astonishing how far it ended up leaning, because that early tilt was about 0.2 degrees, but then it actually maxed out at 5.5 degrees by 1990, even in spite of all of the efforts that took place to try to correct it, including one in 1934 by Benito Mussolini, who really felt as though the lean of the tower was a poor reflection on the nation's reputation, and so allocated resources himself for straightening it up. Only his men then drilled these hundreds of holes into the tower's foundations and then pumped in tons of grout, and that didn't work. It actually made it lean further, and I guess Mussolini then got distracted with other projects because that's how the tower stayed for quite some time.
Well, Mussolini's brand of fascism was all about Italian virility, so having a bent phallic symbol as one of Italy's most recognisable landmarks was obviously not what he wanted.
Right.
That wasn't even the first time that the tower came close to disaster as a result of a harebrained scheme to improve it. So in 1838, there was an architect called Alessandro Gherardesca, and he had the brilliant idea that he could make a nice walkway for visitors if he dug away to expose the sunken foundations of the tower.
Dude, these foundations go like 3 meters deep. Don't expose them any further.
But also, what's the view from the walkway? Like, you're looking underneath you into 3 meters depth and above you into a tower that you can't see is leaning because you're too close.
Well, so it seems like he thought that the original intention of the architects was to have that bit showing, but obviously, like, we know they weren't that good because the tower wasn't built very well in the end. So why follow what they're doing? Anyway, within a few weeks of excavation, the tower was leaning by an extra foot, and so the plan was called off, and the damage obviously then couldn't be repaired. And then obviously you had Mussolini come in and try and straighten the tower out and make it sink even more. So it was this point from sort of the middle of the 20th century up until the 90s when the big renovations started to take place, that the tower was at its most perilous lean.
Yeah, its top was 15 feet further south than its bottom. So it had an incredible lean before they started the latest effort to actually stabilise it.
But stabilise is the important word, isn't it? Because what's changed, between Mussolini and the 1990s is that there's a widespread recognition that it's important that it leans. Like, if they straightened it out, no one would go and see it anymore. So it needed to be leaning, but not leaning so much it's going to topple.
One of the curious things about the tower is that it's very much not susceptible to earthquakes, and there have been a bunch of really strong earthquakes in the region since it was constructed. But its invulnerability is put down to this thing called dynamic soil structure interaction, DSSI, which basically amounts to the idea that when the ground wobbles, the tower stays pretty much static, and so is therefore not affected by things that other buildings might be, and therefore is not particularly prone to falling down because of earthquakes.
I quite like the idea of having earthquake-proof leany buildings everywhere.
Yeah, if that's what you got to do.
Yeah. Why hasn't this caught on?
Better for Instagram, better for not falling down at all.
Well, I mean, you say that. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, Rebecca mentioned the other buildings in Pisa that are also crooked. The cathedral itself is also crooked. But everyone goes to see the bell tower next door. There's an 11th century church that's about 2 miles east of the tower with a 5-degree tilt. But no one goes to see that because it's not very tall. Like, it's only 3 stories. It's less impressive. Just looks like a building falling down. But it's the same thing. Whereas 400,000 visitors pay to climb the tower each year. Someone needs to try and work out a way to spread that money around a bit.
It also isn't the leaniest tower in the world. That accolade goes to the Leaning Tower of Surhusen, which is a German steeple that was erected between the 14th and 15th centuries, that officially outleaned its Pisani rival in 2009, and the Guinness World Record keepers calculated that its tower's tilt now is a full 1.2 degrees further than Pisa's when it was at its very worst in the 1990s.
It's also now the most monitored monument in the world because of the amount of sensors inside, hourly readings on the external and internal temperatures, the wind velocity, the soil movement, which is weird really, isn't it? Because actually if it does properly start to collapse, like through some natural disaster or through some unforeseen thing, what are you going to do?
Well, I think the only thing we can say for certain is that there's going to be a lot of pictures of the Tower of Pisa collapsing with someone in the foreground holding their fingers up in a little bit.
Someone pushing it down finally.
Tomorrow.
He can look like a savage wolf 1 minute. The next, he plays with a little Indian child and wears an almost silly smile.
Love the show? Support the show. Patreon.com/retrospectors. Part of the Acast Creator Network.